He was my brother's best friend in the army. I married him after reading his letters for the first time. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1944, its yellow paper trembling in Margaret Sinclair's hands like autumn leaves caught in a bitter wind. She stood in the doorway of their modest Chicago apartment, still wearing her blue factory coveralls from the night shift at Boeing, her dark hair pinned back with bobby pins that had seen better days. The Western Union boy shifted nervously on his feet, his cap pulled low over eyes that had delivered too many of these messages to families across the South Side. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry," he mumbled, backing away as if the grief might be contagious. If you enjoy these heartfelt stories, consider subscribing to Romance in the War for more beautiful tales. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, appeared behind her, flour still dusting her apron from the morning's bread-making. The older woman's face crumpled as she read the stark official words over her daughter's shoulder. "The War Department regrets to inform you that Private James Sinclair was killed in action on March 15, 1944, in the European Theatre of Operations." But it wasn't just the news of Jimmy's death that would change Margaret's life forever. It was what came 3 weeks later. A battered canvas bag containing her brother's personal effects, forwarded from somewhere deep in the Italian countryside, where the 36th Infantry Division had been pushing north through mountains that seemed to swallow young American boys whole. Inside, among Jimmy's rosary beads, his wallet with a picture of their family, and his lucky silver dollar, Margaret found something unexpected. A stack of letters tied with kitchen twine, written in careful, slanted handwriting that wasn't her brother's. The return address read, Corporal Thomas Bennett, 36th Infantry Division, APO, New York. Margaret had heard Jimmy mention Tommy Bennett countless times in his letters home. They'd met during basic training at Camp Bowie in Texas. Two boys from different worlds who'd become inseparable. Jimmy, the Southside Irish Catholic with calloused hands from working the stockyards since he was 14. Tommy, the small-town Minnesota farm boy who could fix any engine and quoted Robert Frost while cleaning his rifle. "Different as night and day," Jimmy had written, "but he's got my back, and I've got his. That's all that matters over here." Now sitting in the fading afternoon light that filtered through their apartment's lace curtains, Margaret untied the bundle with trembling fingers. The top letter was dated just 2 weeks before Jimmy's death, and as she unfolded the worn paper, she realized these weren't letters to her brother. They were letters from Tommy Bennett, returned undelivered because Jimmy had carried them in his pack when he died. The first letter began simply, "Dear Miss Sinclair, I hope you don't mind me writing to you directly, but Jimmy talks about you so much I feel like I already know you." Margaret's breath caught. These letters were addressed to her, written by a man she'd never met, but who seemed to know her heart better than she knew it herself. "Jimmy showed me the picture you sent of yourself in your new factory uniform, standing next to that B-17 wing you helped build. He was so proud, telling everyone how his sister was doing her part to bring us boys home. But what struck me wasn't just the pride in his voice. It was the way he described how you looked at that airplane, like you were seeing the future itself taking shape under your hands." Margaret set the letter down, her heart pounding. She remembered that photograph, taken by a fellow worker at the Boeing plant. She'd been embarrassed by her appearance. Coveralls too big, her hair escaping its victory roll, grease smudged on her cheek. But Tommy Bennett had seen something else entirely. The letters continued, each one revealing more of the man who had been her brother's closest friend. Tommy wrote about the war, but not the way the newspapers did. He wrote about the Italian children who traded hand-carved wooden toys for chocolate bars, about the way morning fog rolled through olive groves like God's own breath, about the ancient stone churches where they'd taken shelter, and how the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns on the floor, even when everything outside was grey with destruction. "Sometimes I wonder what you think about when you're riveting those airplane wings," he wrote in another letter. "Do you imagine the pilots who'll fly them? The missions they'll complete? Jimmy says you're the philosophical type, always asking the big questions. I'd like to know what questions keep you awake at night." Margaret found herself laughing through her tears. Jimmy had been right. She was always asking the big questions, much to her family's exasperation. Why were they fighting this war? What kind of world would they build when it was over? How could love survive when everything familiar was being torn apart? She set the letter aside and picked up another, dated 2 months earlier. This one revealed more of Tommy's character, his careful observations of the world around him. Today we passed through a small village that had been liberated just last week. The people came out to wave at us, and an old woman pressed a jar of preserves into my hands. Apricot, I think, though I can't be sure. She spoke no English, and my Italian is limited to grazie and per favore. But when she handed me that jar, her eyes filled with tears and she kept saying bambino, bambino, and touching my face like I was her own son. It made me think about what you wrote in your last letter to Jimmy, about how every rivet you place in those airplane wings carries a prayer for the boys who'll fly in them. That old woman's preserves carried the same kind of prayer, I think. A hope that kindness still exists in this broken world, that someone she'd never see again might taste sweetness, and remember that not everything beautiful has been destroyed. Margaret could picture it perfectly. Tommy, probably embarrassed by the woman's attention, accepting her gift with the kind of grace that came from understanding its deeper meaning. She'd seen the same look in the eyes of mothers at the factory when they talked about their sons overseas, a desperate need to nurture, to provide comfort, to believe their small acts of love could somehow reach across impossible distances. But it was the last letter, dated just days before Jimmy's death, that completely undid her. This one was longer than the others, more personal, as if Tommy had known it might be his final chance to say what was in his heart. Dear Margaret, I hope you don't mind me using your first name. After all these months of writing, you feel like family. I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think less of Jimmy for sharing it with me. Last night, we were dug into foxholes about a mile from the German line, and the artillery was coming down pretty steady. Jimmy was in the hole next to mine, and during a lull in the shelling, he started talking about home. He told me about the night before he shipped out, how you cried, not because you were scared for him, but because you were scared you'd never be brave enough to live the life you really wanted. He said you talked about wanting to see the world, maybe become a teacher or a writer, but that you were afraid you'd end up like so many girls in the neighborhood, married to the first decent boy who asked, settling for safe instead of extraordinary. Margaret, I've been thinking about that conversation for weeks now, and I want you to know something. Your brother died believing you were the strongest person he'd ever known, stronger even than any soldier he'd met. He used to say that real courage wasn't about charging into battle. It was about getting up every morning and choosing to hope, choosing to build something beautiful even when the world seemed determined to tear everything down. The letter continued, Tommy's handwriting becoming more hurried, as if he'd been interrupted and was trying to finish his thoughts quickly. I know I have no right to say this, having never met you, but I need you to know that writing these letters has changed me. When Jimmy first suggested I write to you, I thought it was just something to pass the time, a way to practice putting thoughts into words for the girl back home I was supposed to have, but never found. But somewhere along the way, these letters stopped being about practicing and started being about you, the real you that Jimmy described with such love and pride. If we make it through tomorrow's mission, I'm going to ask Jimmy for your address so I can write to you properly, with your permission. If we don't, well, I hope these letters find their way to you somehow. I hope you'll know that somewhere in the mountains of Italy, there was a soldier who never met you, but who believed in the extraordinary life you're meant to live. I don't know if we'll make it through this next push into the mountains. The Germans are dug in pretty deep, and word is we're going to be climbing some treacherous terrain. But I want you to know that writing these letters to you has been the best part of this whole damn war. Excuse my language, but some situations call for damn. Jimmy was right about you being special, Margaret Sinclair. I just wish I'd been brave enough to tell you so in person. The letter was signed, with deep respect and growing affection, Thomas Bennett. P.S. Jimmy says you make the best apple pie in Chicago. When this war is over, I'd very much like to taste it. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. This man, this stranger, who felt like anything but a stranger, was gone. Jimmy was gone. And she was left holding words that felt like promises that could never be kept. But then Eleanor Sinclair, who had been quietly watching her daughter read, sat down beside her on the faded sofa. What do those letters say, sweetheart? Margaret handed them over, watching her mother's expression change as she read. Eleanor had buried her husband 10 years earlier, had raised 2 children alone during the Depression, had watched her son march off to war with a smile on her face, and terror in her heart. She understood love that came in unexpected packages. "Well," Eleanor said finally, folding the letters carefully, "seems to me like you've got a choice to make." "What do you mean?" "This Thomas Bennett, he's alive, isn't he? The telegram only mentioned Jimmy." Margaret's head snapped up. In her grief, she hadn't considered the possibility. I don't know." "Maybe. Then you write to him. You write to the War Department. You find out." Eleanor's voice was firm, the same tone she'd used when Margaret was 7 and afraid to start school. "That boy poured his heart into those letters, and your brother trusted him enough to share your secrets. If he's alive, he deserves to know that his words found their way home." It took 6 weeks and countless bureaucratic hurdles, but Margaret finally learned that Corporal Thomas Bennett had been wounded during the same action that killed Jimmy. He was recovering in a military hospital in England, and yes, he was receiving mail. Margaret's first letter to him was the hardest thing she'd ever written. "Dear Tommy, I hope you remember me. Jimmy's sister, Margaret. I received your letters after he died, and I wanted you to know they meant more to me than I can possibly express. My brother told me once that you were the finest man he'd ever known, and after reading your words, I understand why." She told him about working at the Boeing plant, about how his observation about her looking toward the future had made her realize she wanted to become a teacher after the war. She told him about her favorite books, about how she'd started volunteering at the local USO, reading to wounded soldiers who were shipped back to hospitals in the States. She told him everything except the most important thing, that she was falling in love with a man she'd never met. Tommy's response came faster than she'd expected. "Dear Margaret, your letter was waiting for me when I got out of surgery last week. Don't worry, just some shrapnel in my leg. Nothing that won't heal. I can't tell you what it meant to know that my words reached you, that Jimmy's letters made it home. He talked about you constantly, and I always wondered if you were really as remarkable as he claimed. Now I know you're even more remarkable than I imagined." Their correspondence began in earnest then, letters crossing the Atlantic like migrating birds carrying pieces of their hearts back and forth. Margaret learned that Tommy had grown up on a farm outside Duluth, that he'd studied engineering for 2 years before the war, that he wanted to build bridges when he got home, not just the physical kind, but the kind that connected communities, that brought people together instead of keeping them apart. In one particularly detailed letter, Tommy described his childhood home. The farmhouse sits on a hill overlooking Lake Superior, and in the winter you can see the northern lights dancing across the water like God's own celebration. My mother planted lilac bushes all around the front porch, and every May the smell would drift through the house and make everything feel possible. I used to do my homework at the kitchen table while she cooked dinner, and she'd quiz me on mathematics while stirring gravy, always reminding me that numbers were just another language for describing the world. Margaret found herself dreaming about that farmhouse, about lilac-scented evenings and mathematical discussions over dinner. She wrote back about her own dreams. "I've been accepted to Chicago Teachers College for the fall semester after the war ends. I want to teach elementary school, to help children discover that learning isn't something that happens to them, but something they can actively pursue. I think about having a classroom with big windows where the light changes throughout the day, and bulletin boards covered with student stories and artwork. I want to be the kind of teacher who makes children excited about possibilities they haven't even imagined yet." As the months passed, their letters became more intimate, revealing fears and hopes they'd never shared with anyone else. Tommy wrote about the nightmares that sometimes woke him, about the friends he'd lost, about the weight of surviving when others hadn't. Margaret wrote about the loneliness of working night shifts at the factory, about how she'd started volunteering at the local VA hospital on weekends, reading to wounded soldiers who reminded her of Jimmy, of Tommy, of all the boys who'd given pieces of themselves to this war. "There's a soldier here named Danny Rodriguez," she wrote in one letter. "He's about Jimmy's age, lost his left arm at Normandy. He was studying to be a pianist before the war, and now he sits by the window for hours, just staring at his remaining hand. Yesterday I brought him a book of Chopin's compositions, and we looked at the sheet music together. I can't play piano, but I can read, so I read the musical notations aloud while he closed his eyes and moved his fingers as if he were playing. For 20 minutes his face looked peaceful, I thought about what you wrote about kindness being its own kind of prayer, and I understood what you meant. Tommy's response came quickly. Margaret, what you're doing for that soldier, it's more important than any bridge I could ever build. You're giving him back a piece of himself he thought was lost. That's not kindness, that's love in action. I'm beginning to understand why Jimmy was so proud of you, why he used to say you had the biggest heart in Chicago. I think about you when I'm lying here in this hospital bed, Tommy wrote in July. Not in any improper way, your brother would haunt me if I dishonored his sister, but I think about what it would be like to sit on your mother's front porch and listen to you talk about the books you've read. I think about what it would be like to take you to see the northern lights that dance over Minnesota winters. I think about whether your laugh sounds like music the way Jimmy said it did. Margaret's letters grew bolder as summer turned to autumn. I've been thinking about what you said about building bridges that connect communities, and I realize that's what we've been doing all along, building a bridge between two hearts across an ocean. I know it's unconventional falling in love with someone through letters, but I can't deny what's happening between us. When I read your words, I feel like I'm discovering pieces of myself I didn't even know existed. You asked me once what questions keep me awake at night, and I've been thinking about that. Here's one. Is it possible to love someone you've never touched, never kissed, never held? Because if it is, then I love you, Thomas Bennett. I love your kindness and your wisdom and the way you see beauty even in the midst of destruction. I love that you understood what Jimmy meant about courage, and I love that you've helped me understand it too. Tommy's response was everything she'd hoped for and more. Margaret, you brave, wonderful woman, of course it's possible to love someone you've never touched. I've been in love with you since your third letter, when you wrote about teaching Sunday school children, and how their questions reminded you that wonder was the beginning of all learning. I love your mind and your heart and your spirit. I love that you see possibilities where others see problems. I love that you're not afraid of big questions or complicated answers. I need to tell you something, though. The doctors here say I'm healing well, but I'll always walk with a slight limp. There's shrapnel in my left leg that they can't remove without risking nerve damage. I'll never be the farm boy who could work 12-hour days in the fields. I wanted you to know because if we're building something together, it should be built on truth. Margaret's response was swift and certain. Thomas Bennett, if you think a limp would change how I feel about you, then you don't know me as well as I thought you did. I've been working alongside men with missing limbs, scarred faces, and wounded spirits for the past year at the VA hospital. They're not diminished by their injuries, they're revealed by them. Their courage shows in how they adapt, how they find new ways to contribute, how they refuse to let what they've lost define what they can still become. Besides, she added, in a postscript that made Tommy laugh out loud in his hospital bed, I'm planning to be a teacher, which means I'll be on my feet all day. It might be nice to have a husband who understands the value of sitting down now and then. By autumn, Tommy was well enough to be shipped back to the States, to a rehabilitation facility in San Antonio. Margaret requested leave from the factory and used her carefully saved wages to buy a train ticket to Texas. They'd been writing to each other for 6 months, sharing dreams and fears and hopes, with an intimacy that some married couples never achieved, but they'd never seen each other's faces except in photographs. The train station in San Antonio was a chaos of uniforms and tears, reunions and goodbyes playing out on every platform. Margaret stood near the information booth in her best blue dress, not factory coveralls this time, but a real dress she'd sewn herself from fabric, bought with her first paycheck after learning Tommy was coming home. Her hair was curled and pinned in the latest style, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings for courage. She was holding a sign with Tommy's name on it, but she didn't need it. She recognized him immediately, even walking with a slight limp from his injury, even thinner than the boy in the photographs Jimmy had shown her. He had those kind eyes she'd wondered about, and when he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her understand why soldiers said some things were worth fighting for. Margaret Sinclair, he said, stopping a few feet away as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. Tommy Bennett, she replied, and her voice was steady even though her heart was racing. They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who knew each other's souls but were meeting for the first time. Then Tommy dropped his duffel bag and opened his arms, and Margaret walked into them as naturally as walking into her own home. "You're even more beautiful than your photographs," he murmured into her hair. "You're alive," she whispered back. "That's all that matters." They spent 3 days together before Tommy had to report back to base for his final discharge processing. 3 days walking around San Antonio, talking in person the way they'd talked in letters, discovering that the connection they'd built on paper was even stronger face to face. On their first morning together, they visited the Alamo, and Tommy told her about the Italian churches where he and Jimmy had sheltered during artillery bombardments. "There was this one church," he said, his hand warm in hers as they stood in the mission's peaceful courtyard, built in the 1400s with walls 3 feet thick. "Jimmy and I spent 2 days there during a particularly bad stretch, and he kept talking about how the stones had witnessed centuries of people praying for protection, for peace, for their loved ones to come home safely." "What did you pray for?" Margaret asked softly. Tommy looked at her, this woman who'd walked out of letters and into his life, who was even more beautiful and intelligent and kind than he'd imagined. "I prayed to survive long enough to meet you. I prayed that if I made it home, I'd be worthy of the love you were offering through your letters." They spent their second day by the river walk, renting a small boat and drifting slowly along the water, while Margaret told him about her acceptance to Teachers College, about her plans to specialize in helping children who struggled with reading. "I want to show them that words have power," she said, trailing her fingers in the warm water. "That stories can transport you anywhere, that literature can help you understand yourself and the world around you. Like your letters did for me," Tommy said. "In that hospital in England, when I was wondering if I'd ever feel normal again, your words reminded me that healing isn't just about the body. It's about the spirit, the heart, the connections we make with other people." On their final evening together, they attended a dance at the USO Hall. Margaret wore a yellow dress she'd borrowed from her hotel neighbor, and Tommy, despite his slight limp, proved to be a surprisingly good dancer. As they swayed to "I'll Be Seeing You," played by a small band of local musicians, Margaret felt as if they were the only 2 people in the world. "I have something for you," Tommy said during a slow song, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved and polished smooth. "I made this in the hospital during my recovery. It's not much, but—" Margaret opened the box to find a simple silver ring, not an engagement ring. They both understood that marriage would have to wait until after Tommy's discharge and Margaret's return to Chicago, but a promise ring, engraved with words that made her breath catch. Love built on letters, sealed with hope. "Tommy," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "It's a promise," he said, taking the ring and sliding it onto her right hand. "A promise that no matter how long we have to wait, no matter what obstacles we face, what we've built together through our letters is real and lasting and worth fighting for." On the last evening, they sat on a bench outside her hotel, and Tommy took her hands in his. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we've only just met in person, but I've been thinking about something Jimmy said to me once, right before we shipped out for Italy." "What did he say?" "He said that war teaches you there's no such thing as too much love or too little time. He said that when you find something worth holding on to, you hold on tight, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed to anyone." Tommy's voice was steady, but his hands were trembling slightly. "Margaret Sinclair, I've been holding on to the idea of you for almost a year now. I'd like to hold on to the real you for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." It wasn't technically a proposal. They both understood that marriage would have to wait until after the war, until Tommy finished his recovery and found his footing in the civilian world. But it was a promise, a commitment as binding as any ceremony. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Yes, I'll have you, Tommy Bennett, for the rest of my life." They were married in Chicago on a snowy Saturday morning in December 1945, 8 months after VE Day and 3 months after Tommy's discharge from the army. The ceremony was small but perfect. Eleanor and a few neighbors, some of Tommy's army buddies who'd made it home, Margaret's friends from the factory and the USO, and Father O'Malley, who had baptized Jimmy and watched Margaret grow from a curious child into a determined young woman. The church was decorated with white roses and evergreen boughs, and Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slimmer frame. Tommy wore his dress uniform one final time, the medals on his chest catching the light from the stained glass windows. But what made the ceremony truly special was the reading Margaret had chosen. excerpts from their own letters, read aloud by Eleanor as a testament to the love that had grown from words on a page. "Love built on understanding," Eleanor read from one of Tommy's letters. "Love that sees the extraordinary in the everyday, that finds hope in the midst of loss, that believes in tomorrow even when today is uncertain." And from one of Margaret's responses, "Love that travels across oceans and through time, that transforms strangers into soulmates, that proves the human heart knows no boundaries when it comes to connection and hope." After the ceremony, they held a small reception in the church hall, where Tommy's army buddy Frank played accordion, while couples danced to songs that had sustained them through the war years. Margaret's factory friends presented her with a photo album they'd made, filled with pictures from her time at Boeing, and messages of support for her new marriage. Tommy's mother, who had traveled down from Minnesota despite the weather, gave Margaret a jar of apricot preserves made from fruit grown on the family farm, a gesture that made both Margaret and Tommy think of that Italian woman who had blessed Tommy with her own preserves so many months ago. But the most meaningful moment came when Danny Rodriguez, the wounded pianist from the VA hospital, appeared at the reception. He'd learned to play simple melodies with his remaining hand, and he'd prepared a special surprise. As the evening wound down, he sat at the church's old upright piano and played a one-handed arrangement of "I'll Be Seeing You," the song Margaret and Tommy had danced to in San Antonio. "This is for two people who proved that love can grow from the written word," Danny announced to the small crowd, "and for the brother who brought them together, even though he never got to see it happen." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Danny played, his single hand drawing music from the keys with a grace that spoke of adaptation, determination, and the refusal to let loss define possibility. Margaret and Tommy danced slowly in the center of the room, her yellow dress from San Antonio replaced by white silk, his uniform soon to be packed away forever, but their love deeper and stronger than ever. But the most important guest at their wedding was one who couldn't be there in person. Before they walked down the aisle, Margaret and Tommy visited Jimmy's grave in Graceland Cemetery, placing a small bouquet on the headstone that read, "James Michael Sinclair, 1922-1944, beloved son and brother." "Thank you," Tommy said quietly, his hand on the cold marble. "Thank you for sharing your stories about Margaret. Thank you for making me promise to tell her to be brave. Thank you for being the best friend I ever had." Margaret knelt and touched the stone. "Thank you for bringing me Tommy, Jimmy. Thank you for having such good taste in friends." As they walked back to the car, Margaret's white dress trailing in the snow, Tommy asked her the question he'd been wondering about for 2 years. "What do you think about when you're building something, Margaret? What questions keep you awake at night?" She smiled, the same smile that had made Jimmy proud, the same smile that had made Tommy fall in love with words on a page before he ever saw her face. "I think about how everything we build, airplanes, bridges, marriages, families, starts with faith that it will hold together when tested. I think about how love is the strongest engineering we humans are capable of." She paused, looking back at the cemetery where her brother rested among hundreds of other boys who'd never made it home. "And the question that keeps me awake at night is this: how do we live lives worthy of the sacrifices others made for us?" Tommy stopped walking and pulled her close, there in the falling snow outside a Chicago cemetery. This woman who'd married him after reading his letters for the first time. This woman who understood that love was both an act of faith and an act of courage. "I think," he said, "we love each other as hard as we can, for as long as we can. I think we build something beautiful together. I think we remember that every day we have is a gift that Jimmy and all the others bought for us." Margaret kissed him then, tasting snow and promise and the future they'd build together. When they broke apart, she was laughing, that musical laugh Jimmy had described in letters Tommy would never see. "Well then, Thomas Bennett," she said, "let's go build something beautiful." They drove away from the cemetery toward their new life together. Two people who'd found love in the midst of loss, who'd learned that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards. Behind them, snow continued to fall on the grave of the young man who'd brought them together, covering his headstone with a blanket, as white and peaceful as the future he'd helped them find. In the years that followed, Tommy built bridges across rivers and valleys throughout the Midwest, while Margaret taught third grade in schools from Minnesota to Illinois to wherever Tommy's work took them. Their first home was a small house near Duluth, close enough to the lake that they could see the northern lights Tommy had written about, close enough to his family's farm that they could help with harvest seasons and holiday gatherings. Margaret loved the farmhouse Tommy had described in his letters, with its lilac bushes and kitchen table, where his mother had helped him with mathematics. Eleanor moved to Minnesota after their first year of marriage, unable to bear the emptiness of the Chicago apartment where she'd raised her children. She fit seamlessly into the Bennett family, teaching Tommy's mother her secret for perfect pie crust, while learning to preserve the apricots that grew in their orchard. They had 4 children, who grew up hearing stories about their Uncle Jimmy, who learned that love could grow from letters written by strangers, who understood that families came in all shapes and sizes, including the family they'd gained through loss. Their eldest, James Thomas Bennett, was born in 1947 and grew up to become a teacher like his mother. Their daughter, Eleanor Rose, became a nurse and married a doctor she met during the Korean War. The twins, Michael and Mary, born in 1952, became an engineer and a librarian respectively, each carrying forward the family's commitment to building connections and preserving stories. But perhaps the most special addition to their family came in 1950, when they received a letter from Italy. It was from Maria Francesca, the elderly woman who had given Tommy the jar of apricot preserves during the war. Her grandson, now a young man studying English, had tracked down Tommy's address through army records. The letter, translated carefully into English, read, "Dear Corporal Bennett, my grandmother, Maria Francesca, died peacefully last month at the age of 84. Before she passed, she told me a story about an American soldier who accepted her preserves with such kindness that she never forgot his face. She wanted me to find you and tell you that your gentle spirit in the midst of such darkness gave her hope that goodness still existed in the world. She left something for you." Inside the package was a small wooden cross, hand-carved by Maria's late husband, and a note in Italian that Tommy had translated at the local church, "For the American boy who reminded me that love transcends all languages. May your life be filled with the sweetness you showed to a stranger." Tommy and Margaret hung the cross in their kitchen, where it served as a daily reminder that kindness creates connections that span continents and generations. They began corresponding with Maria's grandson, Antonio, and eventually sponsored his immigration to America in 1955. He became like a son to them, naming his own daughter Margaret in honor of the woman who had welcomed him into their hearts and home. Every year on Jimmy's birthday, the entire extended family would gather in the farmhouse kitchen. They would sit around the same table where Tommy had learned mathematics from his mother, and they would read selections from the original letters that had brought Margaret and Tommy together. The children and grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, as the story of their family's beginning unfolded through words written in foxholes and factory dormitories, in hospital beds and train stations, in all the places where love had refused to be contained by circumstances. And every year on Jimmy's birthday, they would sit together and read Tommy's letters aloud. The letters that had started it all, the words that had traveled across an ocean and through time to create something neither war nor death could destroy. Love letters written to a woman he'd never met, by a man she'd learned to love through the simple act of reading his heart. Their marriage lasted 53 years, until Tommy passed peacefully in his sleep on a winter morning, not unlike the one when they'd first met at that train station in San Antonio. Margaret lived another 7 years, long enough to see grandchildren graduate from college, long enough to teach Sunday school well into her 80s, long enough to know that the love they'd built from letters had become something solid and enduring, a bridge across time that would carry their story forward long after both of them were gone. When Margaret died in 2005, her children found something tucked away in her jewelry box. The original bundle of letters Tommy had written to her during the war, still tied with that same piece of kitchen twine Jimmy had used to keep them together. On top of the bundle was a note in Margaret's careful teacher's handwriting. "These letters taught me that love doesn't always arrive the way we expect it to. Sometimes it comes through loss, through words on a page, through the generosity of someone who loves us enough to want us to be happy. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simple act of being brave enough to write to a stranger." And underneath that, in Tommy's faded script, was a line from his very first letter. "Jimmy talks about you so much, I feel like I already know you. Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded room. Others begin with a dance, a shared laugh, a moment of connection that feels like destiny. But Margaret and Tommy's love story began with returned mail, with words written by a soldier to a woman he'd never met, with the simple faith that love can grow even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times. Their love was built on letters, sustained by trust, and proven by time. It was a love that honored the dead while celebrating the living, a love that understood that sometimes the most profound connections come not from what we see, but from what we dare to believe. And in the end, it was exactly the kind of love story Jimmy Sinclair would have written for his sister and his best friend, if he'd lived long enough to see them find each other through the words he'd helped inspire. A love story written in letters, sealed with courage and delivered across time by the simple revolutionary act of choosing to hope.